It was one of those golden afternoons in early summer when everything seemed to line up perfectly. The weather was warm, but not scorching, the breeze gentle enough to keep the air moving, and the smell of freshly cut grass drifted across the cul-de-sac. For the Thompson family, it was the ideal day to host their long-awaited backyard barbecue. The Thompson backyard was the kind of space neighbors often admired from afar. A wide deck stretched across the back of the house, leading to a neatly maintained lawn with a stone fire pit in the corner. Over the years, the family had worked tirelessly to make it a gathering place, adding string lights, a sturdy grill, and a patio set that could seat the whole extended family. Today, all of it would finally come alive. The plan had been simple: invite close friends, a few neighbors they trusted, and extended relatives who hadn't visited in months. It wasn't a huge party, but it was the kind of event meant to remind people of why communities mattered: laughter, food, and memories under the open sky. The grill was already sizzling, the sound of burgers and chicken popping in rhythm with the distant hum of lawnmowers. Children ran across the grass with water balloons, and the adults settled into chairs with plates in hand. But as the aroma of barbecued ribs and marinated steak filled the air, another smell began to linger. Trouble. Just 3 houses down, Karen noticed the activity. Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood order, had always believed it was her duty to enforce what she called community standards. She wasn't on the HOA board, nor did she have any real authority, but in her mind, she was the sheriff of the block. Karen had a long history of complaints. She had once scolded a neighbor for leaving their trash cans out past noon. Another time she berated a teenager for skateboarding too close to her driveway. Even the slightest deviation from her vision of perfection was, in her eyes, a violation of her unwritten rules. And today, as she stood peering out from behind her lace curtains, she was certain she had found her next target. The Thompson barbecue, with its music, laughter, and unmistakable smell of grilled food, was more than she could tolerate. She convinced herself that it was an eyesore, an assault on the neighborhood's peace. What truly bothered her, however, was the joy radiating from the Thompson backyard. To Karen, happiness she couldn't control always looked like chaos. She stepped outside, arms crossed tightly, her face set in its usual scowl. She could hear the faint sound of country music playing from the Thompson deck, the kind of light-hearted soundtrack that made barbecues feel timeless. Children squealed with laughter as water balloons splashed across the grass. To everyone else, it was harmless fun. To Karen, it was unacceptable noise, and she believed she had a responsibility to shut it down. Inside her head, she began planning. Should she call the HOA and file a complaint? Should she involve the police? Or should she storm over immediately and put an end to it herself? The thought of waiting gnawed at her. She wanted control, and control meant action. Meanwhile, the Thompsons remained oblivious to the storm brewing just down the street. Mr. Thompson had just finished flipping a batch of burgers, while Mrs. Thompson prepared a fresh platter of corn on the cob. Cousins filled plates with potato salad, and grandparents sat back in lawn chairs, smiling at the sight of 3 generations coming together. To them, it was the kind of day worth remembering. But the peace wouldn't last. Karen, driven by her relentless need to impose her rules, tightened her grip on her phone. She had already convinced herself that the barbecue was breaking noise ordinances. Even though it wasn't, she believed smoke from the grill was a hazard, though it was contained and perfectly safe. In her mind, every laugh, every splash of a water balloon, every note of music was proof that the Thompsons were out of control. By the time the first round of food was being served, Karen had made her decision. She wasn't going to wait for anyone else to intervene. She was going to march into that backyard, confront the family head-on, and put an immediate stop to what she saw as chaos. As the sun dipped slightly lower, casting golden light across the Thompson backyard, Karen straightened her blazer, adjusted her sunglasses, and started walking toward the house. With each step, she rehearsed her speech. She imagined herself as the hero of the neighborhood, the one who would restore order. She didn't know it yet, but the confrontation she was about to ignite would set off a chain of events, far bigger than she could ever have predicted. The barbecue was about to become the stage for a battle of wills. Karen thought she had chosen the perfect opportunity to flex her authority. What she didn't realize was that she had chosen the wrong backyard, and as she approached the Thompson fence, the first crack in the peaceful afternoon was about to appear. Karen's heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she marched down the street, each step filled with determination and self-righteous energy. The golden sunlight highlighted her rigid posture, her arms locked tightly against her sides, as though the entire neighborhood were watching her perform a grand act of civic duty. In her mind, this wasn't just about a barbecue, it was about principle. The Thompsons had disrupted the sanctity of the community, and she believed it was her responsibility to put them in their place. The Thompson backyard buzzed with cheerful energy, unaware of the storm drawing closer. The children were still racing with water balloons, their laughter echoing across the lawn. Adults gathered around the grill, plates in hand, filling them with steaming food fresh from the flames. Conversations overlapped, music hummed softly in the background, and the air smelled of smoky barbecue and sweet corn. To the guests, it was a perfect day. Then came the first sign of intrusion, the unmistakable sound of Karen's voice cutting through the noise. Though she had not yet entered the yard, her presence announced itself like a sudden shadow. Guests turned their heads as they saw her approach, her sunglasses reflecting the deck lights strung across the Thompson fence. Karen didn't wait to be invited. She unlatched the side gate with a firm tug and swung it open, stepping inside as though she owned the property. The sound of the latch clanging shut behind her silenced some of the laughter. She stood in the middle of the lawn, hands on her hips, surveying the scene like a warden who had caught prisoners in the act. For the Thompsons, shock quickly turned into quiet irritation. The guests exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what would happen next. Everyone knew Karen's reputation. She had meddled in countless minor affairs round the block, but rarely had she been so bold as to barge into someone's private property uninvited. Karen cleared her throat, making sure she had everyone's attention. In her head, this was the moment she would deliver her carefully rehearsed lines. She believed her voice carried authority, the kind of tone that could not be ignored. Her eyes darted from the grill to the music speaker, then to the children running with balloons. Each detail fueled her anger. She imagined herself writing a list of violations, noise disturbances, smoke hazards, public nuisances. She saw herself filing official complaints, handing them to an HOA that didn't even have rules. For such gatherings, none of that mattered to Karen because in her version of reality, her word was law. The air grew tense. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, forks hovering above plates. Murdoch Thompson paused with a spatula in hand, staring at Karen as she continued her silent inspection. Mrs. Thompson, though stunned, placed a protective arm round the youngest child, as if shielding him from the cold glare of the intruder. It was then that Karen took her first decisive action. She marched toward the speaker playing music and reached as though she might unplug it herself. That small gesture, the audacity to tamper with property, sent a ripple of disbelief through the crowd. Though she didn't touch it yet, the threat was clear. She wasn't here to talk. She was here to control. The guests were no longer merely irritated. They were insulted. A private, joyous occasion had been invaded by a woman who believed she had the right to dictate how others lived their lives. The Thompsons weren't known for confrontation, but this was different. This was their home, their sanctuary, their safe space, and Karen had stepped directly into the heart of it. Karen's voice finally broke the silence. Filled with the edge of authority she always carried when scolding others, she gestured toward the grill, then the children, then the group of seated relatives. She spoke in sweeping accusations, painting the gathering as a disruption, a danger, and a violation of rules that didn't exist. Her tone carried no compromise. She demanded an end to the music, an end to the games, and an end to the barbecue itself. What Karen hadn't expected was resistance. She had grown accustomed to neighbors rolling their eyes, muttering under their breath, but ultimately giving in just to avoid dealing with her further. She believed the Thompsons would do the same, but as she stood there, barking orders and demanding compliance, she felt the weight of the crowd's silence harden against her. The Thompsons didn't argue. They didn't shout. They simply stood firm, their expressions calm but unyielding. It was the kind of quiet defiance that unsettled someone. Like Karen, the guests, too, sat taller, their gazes fixed on her with the same unspoken message: you don't belong here. Karen's confidence wavered, but only slightly. She doubled down, her voice growing sharper as she threatened to call authorities, to involve the HOA, to escalate matters until the family had no choice but to obey. In her head, this was still her victory. She believed that fear would force submission, but fear never came. Instead, there was a steady, growing sense of unity among the Thompsons and their guests. Though they said nothing, their stance alone was a wall she couldn't breach. Every glare, every shake of the head, every folded arm told her she had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. The barbecue resumed in small ways. A child giggled nervously and tossed another water balloon. A cousin reached for a fresh plate of food. Murdoch Thompson flipped another burger, deliberately ignoring the storm raging in his yard. Their message was clear. Karen had no power here. For the first time, Karen felt the sting of rejection. Her demands echoed into the air and faded without effect. Her threats, so often enough to bend others, landed flat against the stubborn wall of family solidarity. She wasn't the authority she believed herself to be. She was just an unwelcome guest who had barged into the wrong backyard. Frustration bubbled in her chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had imagined compliance, maybe even apologies. Instead, she found herself standing alone in the middle of a celebration that carried on around her as if she didn't exist. But Karen wasn't the type to walk away easily. She stormed toward the gate, muttering to herself about consequences, about how this wasn't over. As she slammed it shut behind her and marched back down the street, she was already plotting her next move. The Thompson family had embarrassed her. They had challenged her authority. And Karen, fueled by wounded pride, would stop at nothing to regain control. The first clash had ended, but the real battle was only beginning. The following morning, the neighborhood was still buzzing about the previous day's barbecue. Word spread quickly in cul-de-sacs like this, where every small incident became part of the collective gossip. Guests who had witnessed Karen's intrusion shared the story with neighbors who hadn't attended, and soon enough, nearly everyone knew what had happened in the Thompson backyard. Some laughed about it, amused at the absurdity of her barging into a private family event. Others shook their heads, weary of her relentless meddling. But everyone agreed on one thing: Karen had gone too far. For Karen, however, the embarrassment of the failed confrontation still burned like an open wound. She had walked into the backyard expecting to command respect, expecting to silence the laughter and dismantle the gathering with a few sharp words. Instead, she had been ignored, dismissed by a family who dared to carry on as if she didn't matter. That dismissal stung worse than any insult. Karen thrived on being noticed, on wielding control. To be treated as irrelevant was, in her mind, an unforgivable offense. As she sat at her kitchen table the next morning, staring at a half-finished cup of coffee, she vowed to make the Thompsons regret their defiance. Her first call was to the HOA. Though she wasn't a member of the board, Karen had their number memorized. She launched into a tirade, painting a vivid picture of the chaos she had endured: the noise, the smoke, the unruly children. She exaggerated every detail, twisting a joyful gathering into something that sounded dangerous, even unlawful. She demanded that the HOA take action immediately. But the HOA representative, though polite, wasn't convinced. There were no rules prohibiting barbecues. No noise violations had been recorded. Without evidence, there was little they could do. They promised to look into it, but Karen could hear the dismissal in their tone. Unwilling to accept defeat, she moved to her next option: the authorities. That afternoon, she dialed the non-emergency police line, framing the barbecue as a public disturbance. She spoke with urgency, warning of out-of-control crowds and safety hazards from the grill. Again, she embellished every fact until her story barely resembled reality. The officer on the other end listened patiently, but ultimately explained that no laws had been broken. Without a noise complaint logged during the actual event, there was nothing to pursue. Karen hung up the phone, her frustration deepening. But she wasn't done. She spent the next several hours drafting a formal complaint to the HOA board. She attached photos she had secretly taken during the barbecue, zooming in on smoke from the grill and children holding water balloons, as though they were proof of reckless behavior. Her letter dripped with righteous indignation, accusing the Thompsons of threatening the neighborhood's safety and standards. She demanded fines, penalties, and even a hearing to discuss their violation. While Karen plotted, the Thompson family carried on with their lives, blissfully unaware of the storm she was brewing for them. The barbecue had been a success, a rare chance to bring everyone together and create memories. They didn't realize that Karen's wounded pride had transformed into a vendetta, one she intended to pursue relentlessly. Within days, the whole board received Karen's complaint. Though some members rolled their eyes, others worried about appearances. Even flimsy accusations had to be addressed. A letter was drafted and sent to the Thompsons, requesting a discussion about the barbecue. It wasn't an official violation, but the language was stiff and unsettling. When the envelope arrived in the Thompson mailbox, Mrs. Thompson felt a jolt of disbelief. She unfolded the letter. At the kitchen counter, scanning the accusations with growing anger, words like public nuisance and endangerment leapt from the page, each one more absurd than the last. The idea that their simple family gathering had been twisted into something malicious left her both stunned and furious. Thompson, reading over her shoulder, set his jaw. This wasn't just about a letter. This was about someone trying to undermine their right to enjoy their own property, their own home. They both knew who was behind it, and neither of them was willing to back down. Neighbors soon caught wind of the letter. Some sympathized openly, voicing their support. Others, weary of Hoa politics, stayed quiet, but silently sided with the Thompsons. And Karen, never one to stay silent, made sure to fan the flames. She whispered to anyone who would listen that the barbecue had been dangerous, that she had been brave enough to intervene. She painted herself as the hero, twisting the truth until even she seemed to believe her own lies. But as the days passed, Karen began to sense something she hadn't anticipated: resistance. The Thompsons didn't cower. They didn't apologize. Instead, they started preparing. They reviewed the HOAS bylaws, gathering evidence of their innocence. They reached out to neighbors who had attended, collecting statements that painted the barbecue exactly as it had been: peaceful, safe, and joyful. The more Karen pushed, the more the Thompsons dug in their heels. For every accusation, they had proof of innocence. For every whispered rumor, they had allies willing to speak the truth. Karen had sparked a battle, but it wasn't the one she thought she could easily win. Her attempts to paint herself as the guardian of the neighborhood were beginning to backfire. Neighbors were tired of her meddling, tired of her complaints, tired of her constant need to control. The more she escalated, the more isolated she became. Still, Karen refused to back down. To her, this wasn't just about the Thompsons anymore. It was about her pride, her reputation, her belief that she alone could enforce order. She convinced herself that if she lost this battle, she would lose all respect in the neighborhood. And so, she pushed harder, determined to win at any cost. The Hoa hearing was scheduled. Karen prepared to make her case, armed with photographs, letters, and her unwavering conviction. The Thompsons prepared too, but their strategy was different. They didn't just want to defend themselves. They wanted to expose Karen's lies once and for all. As the day of the meeting drew closer, tension gripped the neighborhood. Lines were drawn, sides quietly chosen. What had started as a simple family barbecue was now a full-blown war of pride, power, and perception. Karen believed she had the upper hand. She thought she was walking into the hearing with an airtight case. But what she didn't know was that the Thompsons had a surprise of their own, one that would turn the tables in a way she could never have imagined. The evening of the HOA hearing arrived with a heavy tension that hung over the neighborhood. Like storm clouds before a downpour, it wasn't just another routine meeting. It had become the stage for a showdown that everyone quietly anticipated. Neighbors who usually avoided HOA affairs suddenly found excuses to attend, curious to witness the clash between Karen and the Thompson family. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest but well-kept space with beige walls, folding chairs, and a long table where the Hoa board members sat in neat formation. At the front of the room, the board shuffled papers, prepared their notes, and adjusted their microphones. They wore expressions of forced neutrality, but behind their eyes lay the weariness of people dragged into yet another neighborhood feud. Karen arrived early, her folder clutched tightly to her chest. She wore her blazer like a uniform, her chin tilted upward, her expression hardened with resolve. She envisioned herself as a lawyer preparing for trial. Certain that her meticulous documentation would secure a victory, inside the folder were photographs of the barbecue, copies of her complaint letter, and a written statement filled with exaggerated descriptions of noise, smoke, and chaos. She believed that once the board heard her evidence, they would have no choice but to punish the Thompsons. The Thompsons, by contrast, walked in as a family. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson entered side by side, calm but resolute, followed by two of their teenage children, who carried binders of their own. Their presence carried a quiet dignity, as if to remind everyone in the room that this wasn't just a petty squabble. It was about their home, their family, and their right to enjoy both. As the room filled with neighbors, hushed whispers spread. Some nodded toward the Thompsons in support, while others cast wary glances at Karen. Everyone knew her reputation, and many were eager to see how the confrontation would unfold. The meeting began with formalities, but soon the focus shifted to the central issue, the barbecue complaint. The HOA president invited Karen to present her case first. Karen stood tall, placing her folder on the table before her, and launched into her argument with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed every word. She described the barbecue as disruptive, painting a vivid picture of blaring music, screaming children, and smoke filling the air. She insisted that the event violated community standards. Even though she couldn't cite a specific rule, she presented her photographs as evidence, holding up images of smoke rising from the grill and children with water balloons, framing them as proof of recklessness. For several minutes, Karen spoke without pause, her voice rising in intensity. She gestured dramatically, scanning the audience as though seeking their approval. To her, this was not just a complaint. It was a performance, one she believed would secure her victory. When she finally sat down, she folded her arms, certain that she had delivered a crushing blow. She glanced toward the Thompsons with a smug expression, convinced they would now be forced to scramble in defense. But the Thompsons were prepared. Mr. Thompson rose first, his tone measured and steady. He thanked the board for their time before calmly dismantling Karen's claims one by one. He pointed out that there were no bylaws prohibiting barbecues, that noise ordinances had not been violated, and that no other neighbor had filed a complaint. He emphasized that the event had been a family gathering, not a wild party, and that every precaution had been taken to ensure safety. Then came the evidence. Mrs. Thompson opened their binder and produced signed statements from neighbors who had attended the barbecue. Each testimony described the event as peaceful, family-friendly, and entirely harmless. Several neighbors who were present at the hearing nodded as their words were read aloud, offering silent confirmation. But the most devastating blow came from a video. One of the Thompson teenagers had recorded clips of the barbecue on their phone, capturing the laughter, the games, and the grill sizzling with food. The video was projected for the room to see. Instead of chaos, the footage showed children tossing water balloons under the golden light of sunset, grandparents smiling from their chairs, and music playing softly in the background. It was undeniable proof that Karen's version of events was not only exaggerated but blatantly false. Gasps rippled through the room. Neighbors exchanged glances, some stifling chuckles at the absurdity of Karen's claims in light of the evidence. The board members shifted in their seats, their expressions betraying a growing impatience with the situation. Karen's face flushed red as the video played. Her confidence, so firm just moments before, began to crumble. She muttered objections, insisting the video didn't capture the real chaos. But her protests sounded weak, desperate. The contrast between her words and the undeniable truth on the screen was to start to ignore. When the video ended, the room was silent. Then Mr. Thompson delivered the final statement, a reminder that Karen had trespassed onto their property, uninvited, during the barbecue. He stopped short of demanding action, but his words carried weight. The implication was clear: if anyone had broken rules, it wasn't the Thompsons. The board conferred briefly, their decision all but inevitable. They announced that no violation had occurred, and the matter was closed. Furthermore, they issued a reminder to all residents about respecting property boundaries and refraining from harassment. The message, though polite, was directed squarely at Karen. The room broke into quiet murmurs as neighbors processed the outcome. Relief washed over the Thompsons, their dignity fully restored. Karen, however, sat frozen, her folder still clutched in her lap, her mouth set in a thin line. She had expected triumph, but instead she had been exposed, her credibility shredded in front of the very people she had hoped to impress. As the meeting ended, the Thompsons walked out to warm smiles and supportive nods from their neighbors. Karen remained seated for a moment longer, staring at the empty table before her. Inside, her anger boiled hotter than ever. To her, this wasn't the end. It was humiliation, and humiliation, in Karen's world, demanded revenge.
Karen's humiliation at the HOA hearing festered like a wound she couldn't heal. For years, she had thrived on her reputation as the neighborhood's unofficial enforcer, the one who always kept others in check. But now, that image had been shattered in front of the very people she sought to control. The board had dismissed her claims, neighbors had laughed behind their hands, and the Thompsons had walked away as victors. In her mind, none of it was her fault. She convinced herself that the board was biased, the neighbors were gullible, and the Thompsons had manipulated everyone with lies and staged evidence. The more she replayed the meeting in her head, the more determined she became to prove that she was right all along. If she couldn't win through official channels, she would take matters into her own hands. Karen's retaliation began quietly. She started with petty tactics, small irritations designed to disrupt the Thompson household. One morning, Mrs. Thompson discovered an anonymous note taped to their front door, filled with vague threats about watching closely and future consequences. Another day, their trash cans were mysteriously knocked over, spilling garbage across the driveway. At first, the Thompsons brushed it off. They knew Karen's temperament and assumed her anger would fade with time. But the incidents escalated. Late at night, the family heard the sound of footsteps near their fence. Packages left on their porch disappeared before they could retrieve them. And on more than one occasion, Mr. Thompson noticed Karen's car idling near their house, headlights off, as though she were keeping watch. Neighbors began to notice, too. Karen's obsession was no longer subtle. She would mutter to anyone who would listen about the danger the Thompsons posed, weaving new stories about wild parties, property damage, and disrespect for the community. But instead of rallying support, her words only deepened the divide. People grew tired of her bitterness, distancing themselves from her one by one. Isolated and frustrated, Karen escalated further. She filed anonymous noise complaints with the city, hoping to bring police to the Thompson home. None of them stuck, but each time an officer knocked on their door, the family's frustration grew. She lodged false reports with animal control, claiming the Thompsons' dog barked incessantly, even though the animal was calm and quiet. She even attempted to contact zoning officials, arguing that their grill violated safety codes. The Thompsons endured it with patience at first, documenting every incident, every complaint, every suspicious occurrence. They wanted to believe the storm would pass. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear that Karen wouldn't stop. Her obsession had grown into a vendetta that threatened not only their peace of mind, but their sense of safety in their own home. Then came the breaking point. One Saturday afternoon, the Thompsons hosted another small gathering, this time just a few friends. Nothing close to the scale of the barbecue. As they chatted on the deck, a sudden hiss filled the air, followed by a sharp smell of chemicals. Looking toward the fence, they saw the unmistakable arc of liquid being sprayed over the wood. Karen, armed with a canister of weed killer, was dousing the edge of their lawn, deliberately letting the chemicals seep into the Thompson yard. The sight stunned everyone into silence. It wasn't just pettiness anymore, it was sabotage, a direct attack on their property. Mrs. Thompson rushed the children inside, fearful of what might happen if they touched the grass. Mr. Thompson, though furious, remained composed long enough to pull out his phone and record the act. That video would become the turning point. Within hours, the footage spread among neighbors. The image of Karen caught red-handed with the canister in hand left no room for denial. Conversations that once carried whispers of annoyance toward her now turned into open condemnation. Neighbors who had once tolerated her antics could no longer excuse them. Karen wasn't just meddlesome. She was destructive, and her obsession had crossed into dangerous territory. The Thompsons reported the incident, filing both with the HOA and local authorities. This time, there was no ambiguity, no room for her to twist the story. The evidence was clear. The HOA board, already weary of her constant complaints, finally had grounds to take action. They scheduled an emergency meeting to address her behavior, with the video at the center of the case. As the date approached, tension gripped the neighborhood once more. This wasn't just about a barbecue anymore, it was about accountability, about whether one person's need for control could be allowed to poison an entire community. Karen, however, refused to see it that way. In her mind, she was the victim. She convinced herself the video had been edited, that the Thompsons had orchestrated the entire event to frame her. She doubled down on her delusions, preparing to defend herself with the same intensity she had brought to the previous hearing. But the truth had already caught up to her. The neighborhood had seen what she had done. The HOA board had evidence stronger than any testimony, and the Thompsons, once her quiet targets, now stood with the support of nearly the entire community. The next meeting wouldn't just decide the future of her feud with the Thompsons, it would determine Karen's place in the neighborhood itself.
The night of the emergency HOA meeting carried a weight the neighborhood hadn't felt before. Residents, who had long ignored meetings, now filled the community center, whispering intense anticipation. It wasn't about dues, landscaping, or minor disputes this time. It was about Karen, her actions, her obsession, and whether the community could endure her reign of disruption any longer. The Thompsons arrived quietly, avoiding the stares that followed them. They carried no anger, only a calm determination to see the ordeal through. In Mr. Thompson's hands rested a small flash drive, the evidence of Karen's sabotage. Behind them, several neighbors offered nods of support, people who had once stayed neutral, but now recognized that silence had allowed Karen's behavior to grow unchecked. Karen entered minutes later, head held high. Though her eyes betrayed the turmoil beneath, she clutched a folder thick with papers, desperate to prove her innocence. To her, this was her last stand, a battle not only to justify her actions, but to preserve her fragile sense of authority in a community that had already turned against her. The meeting began with a stern reminder from the board. Civility was expected, and facts would guide the discussion. But civility was a concept Karen rarely entertained. As soon as the floor opened, she launched into a tirade, waving documents, pointing fingers, and spinning tales of persecution. She insisted the Thompsons had staged everything, that the video was doctored, that she was the true victim of a neighborhood conspiracy. Her words, once sharp enough to sway some, now sounded hollow. The audience shifted uncomfortably, eyes narrowing, lips pressed in disapproval. The patience that had once enabled her was gone. Then came the moment of truth. Mr. Thompson stepped forward, inserted the flash drive, and pressed play. On the screen, there was no ambiguity. Karen, standing at the fence, spraying chemicals directly onto the Thompson yard. Her movements deliberate, her face twisted with frustration. Gasps filled the room as neighbors watched. Some shook their heads, others whispered in disbelief, a few muttered that they had suspected as much. But seeing it made the reality undeniable. The board fell silent for a long moment after the video ended. Karen, flushed with panic, tried to interject, but her words faltered under the weight of the evidence. Every excuse she had prepared dissolved. There was no manipulation, no conspiracy, only her actions, captured in clear detail. One board member, usually soft-spoken, addressed her firmly. Enough was enough. The neighborhood could no longer tolerate behavior that crossed into sabotage and harassment. Karen's conduct had violated multiple HOA bylaws and endangered both property and residents. The recommendation was swift: removal from the HOA board, heavy fines, and restrictions on her ability to file further complaints without evidence. The room erupted not in chaos, but in a collective sigh of relief. Neighbors who had quietly endured her antics for years finally saw justice served. For once, the weight of her authority had lifted, replaced by accountability she could not escape. Karen, however, could not accept it. She stormed out of the meeting, papers scattering in her wake, muttering about appeals and lawsuits. Yet even as she left, it was clear she had lost something far greater than the board's support. She had lost her grip on the neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, the transformation was unmistakable. The Thompsons lived in peace, free from the constant harassment that had shadowed their every move. Neighbors gathered more freely, children played without fear of complaints, and community events regained the joy they once had. The barbecue that had sparked it all was no longer a symbol of defiance, but of unity. Karen, meanwhile, grew increasingly isolated. The same neighbors who once entertained her grievances now crossed the street to avoid her. Her voice, once loud enough to dominate meetings and spread discord, became little more than an echo of a past no one wanted to revisit. Her retaliation had destroyed the very authority she craved. For the Thompsons, the ordeal became a story they would retell not with bitterness, but with a sense of triumph. They had faced relentless hostility, endured attempts to break their spirit, and emerged stronger. Their backyard barbecue, once nearly shut down by Karen's fury, became an enduring reminder of resilience. The neighborhood had learned a lesson. Too, they realized that silence in the face of bullying only fueled the fire. But when they stood together, the balance of power shifted. Karen's downfall wasn't just the Thompsons' victory, it was the community's reclamation of peace. And so the saga ended not with a single act of revenge, but with something far greater: the collapse of Karen's reign and the restoration of harmony in a place that had nearly been consumed by her obsession. The backyard that started it all, once a battleground of complaints and confrontations, now glowed with the warm light of evening gatherings. Laughter returned to the air, free and unbothered. The barbecue grill, once a source of contention, became a symbol of togetherness. Karen had tried to shut down a family barbecue, but in the end, it was her own legacy that burned away.